Okay, good morning, everyone. Good evening to those for whom that is the more appropriate greeting. Welcome back to Rabbi Silber's class on Genesis. This is the penultimate session for this term, penultimate session of this class. We still have other classes throughout the week, but we will have to take a break for Pesach, whether we want to or not, but hopefully we do want to, and Drisha has lots of programming coming up to help us get a little more, if not excited, then at least a little more involved with the feelings of the Pesach season, starting today at noon with the annual Rappaport Memorial Lecture, which is on a Pesach week theme, we'll say. So I know that we already have over 100 folks signed up for that. If you are not signed up, please feel free to join in. But for this class, I would like to, again, remind everyone here on Zoom, when I send you an invitation to become a panelist, that does not obligate you to do anything, but it does allow you into the room so that you can show us your face on camera, if you would be so kind, and it enables you to mute and unmute yourself during our periods of question, answer, discussion without needing to seek additional permission from me. If you continue to reject the invitation to become a panelist, I will get the picture eventually. I am not doing it to annoy you. I'm doing it to give you an opportunity. So of course, you're also welcome to post questions and comments in our chat here. If you're joining us on Facebook Live, post your questions and comments right below the video in the comment section. And if you're joining us on Drisha Live, hello, we're glad that you're learning with us. So the text for this class is still in the Tanakh. So you are, of course, welcome to use your most beloved physical book if you have one available at hand and easily navigable for you. Otherwise, I will do my best to keep the pertinent text up on screen for your convenience. Without further ado, Rabbi Silber, please.
Thank you, Noah. Okay, so let's just pick up where we left off last time. We completed, or one never completes, but we've read through all of chapter 34, the story of Dinah. One of the issues that we raise, the text raises it, is what is the viewpoint of the narrator of the Torah itself? What position does the Torah take about the various characters and behaviors of those characters in chapter 34? So the position that I took was that the Torah does not particularly take anybody's side. The Torah, I think, has ample criticism, raises questions about all the characters in the story. Each one has something to say about it in a positive sense, and each one can be looked at with a critical eye as well. The very end of the chapter, chapter 34, the very end of the chapter, we have Yaakov admonishing specifically two of his sons, Shimon and Levi. That's in the next to last verse of chapter 34. Vayom Yaakov Shimon v'Levi achartem oti. V'avisheni b'Yosheva aretz b'achani u'v'aprizi v'ani matei mispar v'nesvu Levi kuni v'yishmati ani u'beiti. So he says to them, achartem, which is a very powerful word, achartem oti. You have sullied me, you have dirtied me, you have betrayed me, perhaps. And he puts it in terms of the potential consequences of their behavior, or their action, which was to massacre the town of Shechem. And he said, you have endangered me and my family. Ani mitei mispar nesfu Levi kuni v'nishmati ani u'beiti. He does not directly say you did the wrong thing. He puts it in terms of the consequences. And their response, either to him directly, they said to Yaakov. I don't think the better reading, I think, is they said to themselves. By Yomru, they said perhaps about Yaakov or about the situation. Should he, presumably Shechem, be allowed to treat our sister like a prostitute? However, the ambiguity of who is the he is interesting. It could be Shechem and also Yaakov. In other words, Yaakov through his criticism, through his seeming lack of concern for our sister, and the word achotena was a very important word here. It's their sister. His behavior suggests that she's still kind of a tramp, prostitute, or whatever. So there's a response, and they actually get the last word in the chapter, which has led people like Sternberg to presume that the Chumash takes their side. I don't believe that's the case. I do believe that it takes no one's side, not Yaakov's either. The question, of course, is whether Yaakov's, and his point being that they're taking the high moral ground. They're saying we did the right thing, despite the consequences, whatever they may be. You do the right thing. And Yaakov's critique of them is put in terms of consequences. It's going to be a bad outcome, rather than saying you did the wrong thing. One can question whether that actually is true. It is certainly true. That's what he says, that you achartem oti lahavisheni. But the question is what achartem oti means. Is achartem oti means simply you've made me look bad, you sullied me, in that you've endangered me and my family, which is an interesting position to take. Yes, you've saved one person at the expense potentially of many others. Okay, you could say that's simply a utilitarian argument. You could also claim it's not. It's a moral argument, that you don't save the one at the expense of the greater. That's an interesting question. But I question whether achartem oti means that, whether achartem oti is limited to the consequences, whether achartem means you betrayed me, period, you've misbehaved, and on top of that, you've also endangered the family. Now, later in the Chumash, when Yaakov blesses his children at the end of Sefer Bereshit, he includes all of the children, but he does say about Shimon and Levi, they are achim. He starts with Shimon v'Levi achim in chapter 49. It's interesting, he calls them achim. Shimon v'Levi achim, they are brothers, which maybe plays off the whole story over here, where they're called achei Dinah. It says that Shimon and Levi on the third day, vayichu shnei b'nei Yaakov, in verse number 25, yes, Shimon v'Levi achei Dinah ish chabo, Dinah's brothers. So it puts them in terms of brothers. They are the brothers who unite to defend their sister. And the last word of the chapter is achotenu, our sister. And when Yaakov blesses all of his sons in chapter 49, in chronological order, first with Reuben, and then Shimon and Levi, he gives them a joint blessing. Shimon v'Levi achim, chapter 49, verse number 5. Shimon v'Levi achim. He actually blesses them together. One might say it's not much of a blessing, it's a critique, but he includes them. But he calls them achim. But klei chamas mecherotehem, their weapons are tools of lawlessness. B'sodam al tavon nafshi, b'kalam al techad kvodi. I don't want to be included in their council or their assembly. Ki bi'apam harguish uv'ritzonam ikbushar. Because in their anger, they slay a person, and when they please them, they maim an ox. And I think that over here, and he could, the next verse is Arur apam kiyaz. Scroll down. Arur apam kiyaz. Cursed be their anger. Vevratam ki kashata, and their wrath. Again, their anger is relentless. I will divide them. Achakem biyakov. Vafitzem bi Yisrael. They're dangerous when they're together. I will scatter them in Israel, which is what happens later in the Chumash, where Shevet Levi is separate from the other tribes. And Shimon in the Chumash almost disappears. So Yaakov's critique, or one might call it even a curse of sorts, does happen later in the Chumash. But what's interesting is that he doesn't curse them, he curses their anger. Having said that, the point is, and here it's an important point about their anger, it's pretty clear in the Chumash that one of the defining moments in Sefer Bereshit, in fact, in Jewish history, is the story of Joseph and the sale of Joseph. First, the thought of killing Joseph, and then the ultimate sale of Joseph. It's clear that in the story of the sale of Joseph, the brothers who are the leaders in killing at first and then selling Joseph, well, he gets sold. But the idea of killing Joseph was, they said one spoke to the other, but we know that Reuven tries to save Joseph, and Judah suggests they sell Joseph. That's son number 1 and son number 4. So son 2 and 3 are the ringleaders in terms of the attempted murder of their brother Joseph. So the point is that the anger, it could be over here in the story of Shechem, one might justify what they did, although it does seem quite excessive. But it's the same anger that, and the emphasis on achotenu, our sister, Achei Dinah, that these two who are brothers, they're the main culprits, the attempted murder of their brother. So once again, I think the Chumash, I don't think we should necessarily presume that Yaakov's statement to Shimon and Levi is purely pragmatic. Achartem in the sense that lahavisheni, but rather achartem oti period. And in addition, it took this particular form, but the behavior is a dangerous behavior, and it plays out in many, many different ways. In any event, so the argument, the claim that I was making, and I stick to it, is that the Chumash in the story of Dinah parcels out its criticisms. There's nobody who's it's not black and white. Nobody, not the villain Shem, because on the other hand he loves her. He does seem to love her. Speaks tenderly. Is willing to do anything to make it right. Sounds that way. On the other hand, Shem and Hamor. Question is when they're selling their story when they're trying to influence Yaakov and the brothers to permit Dinah to marry Shem, they say one thing, but they're trying to convince the people of Shem to circumcise themselves, the men to circumcise themselves. They have a very different story. We'll be able to co-opt them and take them over, etc. So in that sense, one could see the town of Shem, which bears the same name as the person Shem, as somehow accomplices after the fact, one might say. That's how Sternberg reads it. And Sternberg thinks the Torah takes their side, which of course I don't. And now we come to Shimon, Levi, and the brothers. Now in the chapter, actually, the Chumash does distinguishes Shimon and Levi from the other brothers. Shimon and Levi are the ones who killed the people of Shem. The question is, are Shimon and Levi participants in the other piece of it, which is taking the spoils? That's to me very unclear. I would say yes, but Yaakov singles them out because of the killing of the killing. In any event, just wanted to briefly look at a story that we've alluded to several times, which is deeply connected to the story of Dinah. There are several stories in the Bible that are deeply connected to the story of Dinah, but the one that's most obvious is the story of Amnon and Tamar in Sefer Shmuel, in 2 Samuel chapter 13. Just for a moment, we can't get into that in any detail, but in the story of Amnon and Tamar, casts a light upon our story. The story of Amnon and Tamar, in short, is that this story is chapter 13 of 2 Samuel, Shmuel Bet, follows chapter 12, obviously. Chapter 12 and chapter 11 are the story of David and Bathsheba. So David and Bathsheba are chapters 11 and 12, and Amnon and Tamar is chapter 13. That's important to note when you're studying Shmuel. But in any event, in the story of Amnon and Tamar, it's like this. This chapter begins by telling us at the very beginning that David, who's an aging king at this point, has two sons. He has more than two, but for our purposes, he has two main sons. One is named Absalom, and the other is Amnon. Amnon is his oldest son. In the biography early, it says he's the oldest. Absalom is the third oldest. The second oldest is irrelevant. For other reasons, he's not in stories. But you have son number one. Essentially, these are the two potential successors to David. Amnon being the oldest, Absalom being second. And Absalom has a sister. She's his full sister. They share a mother and a father. The father is David. And Amnon, Ben David, as he's called in verse number 1, is the half brother of Tamar. The sister is named Tamar. The half brother is Amnon. The full brother is Absalom. Now we can't get into all the details of it, but to jump ahead in the story, Amnon becomes infatuated with his half sister, and the half sister stays inside the palace. She doesn't leave the palace. She stays in the palace, and Amnon can't have access to Tamar. We don't know why he wants access. If he wants to talk to her, convince him, whatever it is, he wants to sleep with her, whatever it is, we don't know yet. So in the story, he becomes infatuated with her, and he becomes sick. He can't imagine how he can get access to Tamar. That's how the story begins. So he has, if you just scroll down, he has a friend named Yonadav. Yonadav is his friend, also a relative. He's a son of David's brother. So he's a cousin. He's very smart. So he says to Amnon, what are you upset about? I'm in love with my sister. I'm in love with Absalom's. I'm in love with Tamar, the sister of my brother Absalom, is what he says. The point over here in the story, and we can't get into the story, but the point is that in the book of Shmuel, and this is a very important point, book of Shmuel is about people. It's a story about people. And it's also a story about politics. In other words, Absalom and Amnon are not simply involved over here because of Tamar, but Absalom and Amnon are the two potential successors to King David, the oldest son and the third, essentially the next oldest son, because son number 2 doesn't count for other reasons. So therefore, there's also political. And we know in the book of Shmuel and the beginning of Kings that taking, for example, the kings, sleeping with the king's consort, the king's concubine, the king's daughter, the king's mistress, whatever, is a political act, not just a social act, but a political act. So that's the complication in the story over here. That's an important complication. In short, what Yonadav says to advice he gives to his cousin is, pretend you are sick, which is not difficult because actually he is sick. He's infatuated and he's sort of lovesick, one might say. So pretend you're sick, and if you scroll down, you'll see, and ask, right, lie down, keep going down, and speak to your father, speak to King David, and ask him to send you Tamar, your sister, to give you something to eat, to restore your spirits, to restore your health. Right, so in other words, what Yonadav says is this is the way you get access to Tamar. Now, what's interesting is that earlier in the chapter it says that Yonadav is very smart, ish chacham ma'od, and the question is, what is the great wisdom over here? What is the chachma here? He's very clever. What's so clever? You have to be a genius to figure this out. But the cleverness, and this is very important for the story of Amnon and Tamar, the cleverness is to have the king send her. It's not just to get access to her, but the king sending her, sending Tamar to Amnon, suggests that the king is okay with whatever happens, that Amnon has the support of the king. And that's very important, especially when you talk about the political side. In other words, if in fact what the story is about is not just this infatuation with Tamar, rape of Tamar, but that is a political act. What it's saying is, I am in fact lording it over Absalom, because Absalom is his rival. The same way Absalom will sleep later with his father's concubines as a political act. It's not a social act, it's a political act. So that's what happens in the story. So Amnon, I can't go with the whole details. Let's scroll down quickly. Keep going. So David sends her, keep going, keep scrolling down, keep going. Well, a lot more verses. Keep going down, right? Keep going down. I stop. Fine. So then he brings her into the house, and then he sends everybody away, and then he says, come into the room, and then he says, sleep with me. And she tries to talk him out of it. He grabs onto her. He says at verse number 11, and she says to him, Al ta'aneni, don't al ta'aneni inui. That's how chapter 34 began, right? Vayaneha, story of Dinah. It says, Ki lo yehu asarchein b'Yisrael al ta'aseh tanvala hazot. Verse number 12, which is word for word basically what you have with Dinah, right? In chapter 34, it's exactly what it says. Starts with inui. And then it says that the brothers came back and they heard what had happened and they were very angry and they were sad. Yaakov Let's find that verse. That's in verse number 7 of chapter 34. Chapter 34, verse number 7. It's almost word for word. So verse number 7, the Dinah story finds its way into the story of Amnon and Tamar. Okay, let's get back to Amnon and Tamar. So it's word for word, essentially, right? Now we go back to chapter Shmuel. Just keep going back. And then she says to him, it's a terrible thing, she says in verse 13. Will I carry my cherpati? That's another Dinah word. Cherpa ilanu. You'll be like one of the nivalim. Speak to our father, he will not refuse me to you. Okay, so that's a very interesting verse because they're related. It's a half sister, half brother, which in the Chumash is one of the forbidden. It's in the list of the various prohibited relationships. It's incest in the Chumash. Here it sounds like it's not a problem. Interesting question. Leave it aside. In any event, he doesn't listen. He rapes his sister. Keep going. Then he throws her out. He hates her with a great hatred afterwards, and he says, "Leave, get out." He says. So then, in verse number 16, she says, "This is worse than the other thing you're doing. Don't throw me out." He refuses to listen. He calls his young man in verse number 17. He throws her out of the house and he locks the door. Fine. That's the first part of the story. And then she's wearing a ketonet pasim, a Joseph-like tunic, whatever, and she tears it. And she walks around and she's crying. And meanwhile, keep reading, keep going. So Absalom speaks to her. He says to her, be silent. And she remains in the house of, she remains forlorn in the house of her brother Absalom. Keep going. Scroll down. King David heard, was very angry, but he does nothing. So David does nothing. Then it says that Absalom doesn't speak to Amnon for a long time. Because he hates him, because he had violated his sister Tamar. 2 years later, in verse 23, right? Absalom is shearing the sheep. It's always a festive time. He invites the royal family. He goes to the king, says, "Please, King David, please come to my party." So David says in the next verse, keep going down. David says, "No, I don't want to. It's too difficult if I come." He insists. No, I'm not coming. He gives him a blessing. So Absalom says, "If you're not going to come, how about Amnon? Send Amnon. He's in your place." So the king says, "Why do you want him?" Maybe the king suspects something. So Absalom, keep going down, insists, urges him down. He sends Amnon, right? Sends Amnon. And Absalom instructs his attendants, when Amnon is merry with wine, kill him. Don't worry about it. In verse 29, they do exactly that. They kill Amnon. All the other members of the family, all the brothers run away. And then in verse 30, a rumor reaches David that Absalom has killed all of the king's sons. Not one is remaining. Keep going down. Keep going. King tears his garments. And then Yonadav speaks up in verse 32. Yonadav says, "No, it's a false rumor," he says. "Don't pay attention to that. He only killed Amnon. He was angry about the business with Tamar, the business that he had violated his sister Tamar." And sure enough, they all come back and they all again tear their garments. Absalom runs away. That in brief is a summary of chapter 13 of 2 Samuel, the story of Amnon and Tamar. Now, let me just briefly make a point about Amnon and Tamar. When you think about the story of Amnon and Tamar, you could actually line up the characters. Dinah in the Tamar story is Tamar. Dinah was the one who was Vayaneha Inui with Dinah, Inui with Tamar. So they're similar in that respect. They're the victims in both stories. The bad guy, Shem, is the bad guy in Dinah's story. And his parallel in the story of Amnon and Tamar is, of course, Amnon. So Amnon is Shem. Then you have Yaakov, who does nothing in the story of Dinah. And the parallel in the story of Amnon and Tamar is David, who does nothing. And finally, you have the Shimon and Levi, and maybe the other brothers as well, but it's Shimon and Levi who kill Shechem and Hamor in the town of Shechem. And the parallel is, of course, Absalom, who kills his brother or commands that his brother Amnon be killed. So the characters line up perfectly well. There's one character who doesn't line up in the story, which is very interesting, and that is Yonadav, the advisor who appears at the beginning of the chapter and the end of the chapter. He has no parallel in the story of Dinah. I can't get into that now. It's in my book. I talk about that. But the other four characters obviously are parallel, and the language is similar. Inui, Nevala, Lo Yasachein B'Yisrael, Cherpa. The language is drawn to some extent from the Dinah story. Now the question is, what does the story of Amnon and Tamar, through this particular prism, there are many prisms to read the story, but the prism of Amnon and Tamar, what does it say about the Dinah story? That's the question. Question is obvious. And the answer, I believe, is part of the answer is the following. When you think about the story of Amnon and Tamar, which of course is neither about Amnon nor about Tamar. It's not really about either one of those two. It's about two other people. It's about David and Absalom, which of course is at the heart of the book of Shmuel. When you think about, for example, Tamar and Dinah, they're not the same characters, because the story of Dinah, Dinah is, one might say, even a prop. Dinah is not a person in the story. She's a human being who's been violated, yes. But we have absolutely no idea beyond that of how she feels. This guy's in love with her now. Does she want to stay with him? Does she want to leave? What is her feeling? Did she resist in any way? We have absolutely no idea. The Chumash never tells us. Unlike the story of Tamar. In the story of Tamar, first of all, she tries to talk him out of it. Two different occasions, before and after, she tries to talk him out of what he plans to do. And on top of that, it says when he grabbed onto her, it says, "Vayechazak mimena." He was more powerful than she, so it would appear she actually tries to fight him off. She's a real person in the story. She tries to tell him the right thing to do. She has advice. She struggles with him. Okay, he overpowers her. But that's very important, because when you have a person in the story, right? Then the villain is much more villainous. In other words, the impression the reader gets when you read the story of Amnon and Tamar is that Amnon is a very bad guy. And when you think about it in terms of Shechem, he's a very, very bad guy, because in the story of Shechem, what the Chumash has presented us with Shechem is somebody that after the fact sounds like he wants to make it right. It sounds like he actually is in love with this person, with Dinah. That's what it sounds like. Speaks tenderly to her, he loves her, is willing to pay any price, etc. In the case of Amnon, it's exactly the opposite, because afterwards he actually throws her out. And even though she begs him not to do that, she says, this will be even worse. Sounds strange to our ears, but in the Chumash, the punishment for the rapist of the unmarried woman, he has to marry her and keep her his entire life. He can never get rid of her. He has to care for her, or he has to provide for her his whole life. That's the punishment. That's the way the Bible presents it. And here he throws her out. So in other words, it makes Amnon a much worse person with no redeeming qualities. There's other evidence as well. That's the first. Those two characters are different. They're similar, but we know the differences. And now we come to the two main characters, to David and to Absalom. In the case of David, you have David and Yaakov. Each one does nothing. And the question is, who comes off worse in the story? Is David worse, or is Yaakov worse? And it strikes me, without question, that actually David is a lot worse for the following reason. Because in the case of Yaakov, true, it's his daughter. But The story of Dinah begins with the verse, "Vatetze Dinah bat Leah asher yoda Yaakov gerot bivnot haaretz." That Dinah went out. Whether going out is problematic or not problematic, it's a separate question. But she went out. But in the case of Tamar, David sends her. In fact, that exactly was the advice of Yonadav. Have the king send her to you. Since the king is sending her, that gives the impression that the king actually, whatever happens, that the king supported it. And even if he doesn't support it, he's certainly part of it. He can't say, I don't want to get involved. It's not my problem. Of course, it's your problem. You sent her there. So in the case of Dinah, he didn't send her. Yaakov does send Yosef later. He sends Yosef to the brothers, and to that degree, not that his intention was that Yosef would get hurt. He wants to make peace. But the point is, he can't actually say in the story of David can't say, I'm not involved. You are involved. You're an accessory. You sent her. Okay, you were misinformed, whatever. It doesn't matter. Whatever your intentions may be. So David's inaction is problematic. And now we come to the main person in the story, which is Absalom. When we're studying Shmuel, we spend a lot of time on Absalom. Absalom is not Shimon and Levi. He's much better than Shimon and Levi, and for multiple reasons. First of all, he's much better than Shimon and Levi because Amnon is worse than Shechem, because Tamar is more of a sympathetic character, because David, who should do something, does nothing. And in the story of Amnon and Tamar, there are two important facts about Absalom. The first is he waits for 2 years. He's waiting for David to do something. David does nothing. Then what choice does he have? He's waiting for David to do the right thing, to punish Amnon in some way. David does nothing. But the second point, and this is a very important point, and this is evidence to me that the book of Shmuel is consciously playing off the story of Dinah, because the initial rumor. Why do we have that part about the rumor? They hear that David hears a rumor, he's killed all of my sons. Oh no, says Yonadav, he didn't kill all of your sons. He only killed Amnon because Amnon, molested Tamar. But what's the point of the rumor? So the point of the rumor is simply, were he like Shimon and Levi, he might have killed all of the sons. He holds David responsible. In fact, he invites David to come initially. Oh, you can come, send Amnon in your place. One can only wonder if David had gone, what would have happened to David? It's a good question. We know later he tries to kill David. But my point is, Absalom in the story kills the one villain. He doesn't kill anybody else. And the text emphasizes that by having the initial rumor, which would put him in the same boat as Shimon and Levi. That's not what he does. So I'd say two things. He waits for 2 years. Now, why is he waiting for 2 years? One could have multiple suggestions about that. I believe he waits for David to do something. And why do I say that? Because later in the book of Shmuel, we have a similar story. After Absalom is brought back, but not brought back to David, Absalom flees the country. He's brought back by Yoav. And then he's waiting for David to accept him back, but David refuses to do that. David places him under house arrest. Absalom is waiting. Nothing happens. He waits for 2 years. And then he sends people to burn Yoav's field. So Yoav comes to, why did you burn down my field? So I'm waiting for 2 years, he says. Nothing's happening. Listen, bring me to the king. If he kills me, he kills me. But I want to see the king. I want to be under house arrest. I came back to be accepted by the king. Waits for 2 years. That's his time frame, 2 years. So I believe in both cases, he's waiting for someone to do what he thinks is the right thing. And when it doesn't happen, he takes action. So this is actually very interesting because it's a wonderful example of how a later story plays off an earlier story, but also of how the latest story, at least through the prism of Sefer Shmuel, you could say there are many different ways to read story, but at least the book of Shmuel is reading that story in a certain way. And of course, in the story of Amnon and Tamar, it's all about David and Absalom. That's what the story is actually about. I maintain that in the story of David and Absalom, that Absalom actually in that chapter is a hero, and his behavior in that chapter would suggest he's the perfect candidate to become the next king. Especially since Amnon is certainly not, and Absalom is caring for his sister. But caring for the sister, okay, he is a killer. So is David. But the point is, but he waits, and if anybody ever deserved it, it's got to be Amnon. The Torah compares rape to murder, by the way. So the point is, he is the right guy, and that is very important for the book of Shmuel because he's the correct successor who never succeeds. But coming back to our study, which is the story of Breshit and the story of Dinah, the story of Dinah is not really about Dinah. The story of Dinah is about something else, which is, but what about Yaakov and Yaakov's sons? And we have to remember that Yaakov took a vow back in chapter 28 to build the bayit, to build the inclusive structure. And this chapter takes us back to the difficulties in including everybody. Because in this chapter, two of his sons, certainly Shimon and Levi, son number 1, son number 2, and son number 3, certainly are completely at odds with Yaakov. And furthermore, they seem to, or the Torah seems to emphasize, perhaps, that Yaakov's inaction, one of the factors may be that Dinah Bas Leah, it's not Joseph, it's not Rachel's, now it's also a daughter. So it could be also a factor. It's a daughter and it's Leah's daughter. So the fact of the matter is that this raises the question, which is the critical question from here to the end of Sefer Breshit, which is this idea of building the house, of building the bayit, the difficulties attendant upon trying to build the inclusive structure, because the structure that Yaakov has built, because of where Yaakov is coming from in his whole history, is the structure which has within it all kinds of frictions, all kinds of conflicts, all kinds of potential disruptions. And here we have right here in chapter 34, at the end of the chapter, we have a very bitter critique of Yaakov by two of his sons and Yaakov's very strong indictment of Shimon and Levi. That's what I wanted just to briefly bring in the story of Amnon and Tamar. It's actually, there's a lot more there as well, but up for now, that's sufficient. So let me stop here and take any comments or questions, and then we'll move on to chapter 35. Yes.
Are you saying that if Shimon and Levi were the sons of Rachel, Yaakov would not have been as critical of them?
I wasn't saying that so much. I was saying that it's very hard to know. No, I wasn't saying that. I was saying that if Dinah had been Rachel's daughter, or if Dinah had been Don and not Dinah, Yaakov might have acted differently. I mean, at the end of the day, he's blessing the bayit. I'm not saying the women aren't included, but it is a patriarchal book. He blesses his sons. He has other daughters that would appear. So my point is twofold. The main point I was making is that the focus in the story is this Dinah bat Leah. We know that Yaakov favors Rachel. It's the woman he loved, and he favors Joseph. My point is that there's a very sharp contrast between Yaakov's concern for Joseph on one hand, and Yaakov's seeming lack of concern for Dinah. Yaakov says, "Oh, he will mourn Joseph till he dies," he says. Everybody's trying to console him. He can't be consoled. But I think there's a very striking contrast between his response in chapter 34 and the story of Joseph later. Now, they're different stories, obviously, but I do believe that this Dinah bat Leah and Achei Dinah and Shimon and Levi, that factors into the story, which is all about, he wants to build a bayit. Me and my bayit are going to be destroyed. And the reader says, Yaakov, your bayit is being destroyed right now. bites in the course of dissolving. That's my point. And that's the core issue over here. The same way the core issue in the story of Amnon and Tamar is succession. David is not young. David's old. Who's going to succeed him? There's no clear successor, actually. So Absalom ben David and Amnon ben David are clear potential successors, and one kills the other. That's the point. Anybody else? Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's striking that Tamar is named Tamar. How does Tamar of the Book of Samuel relate to our Tamar in the book?
It's in my book. I talk about that. Obviously, they are related. I can't get into that. It would take too much time because I'm not really doing the story of Amnon and Tamar. What we're learning that, we go into that. But clearly, I will just say that the following. The story of Tamar is the story of Tamar. I mean, we'll get to it. It's a couple of chapters later. It's chapter 38. But it's also basically the hero of apart from Tamar is the hero. He's like the Rebbe, but the hero, the main character of the story of Tamar is Judah, Yehuda. And that the Yehuda of chapter 38 appears in two different forms. There's the early stage of Yehuda before Tamar engages him, and there's afterwards. And that the author of Shmuel takes the story of Yehuda with Tamar and breaks Yehuda down into two pieces. The early Judah, that's Amnon, basically. One who throws Tamar out of his house, right? Kicks Tamar out of the house. That's Amnon. The Judah who confesses and is able to reconcile and becomes the catalyst to build a family, that's Absalom in the story. So that's how it, among other things, how it uses that particular story. Susie, what do you want to say? Yep.
Two things. One thing, you said a few times that the Torah seems to be blaming everybody a little bit. Do you include Dinah in that? Because Chazal like to say, because if I say Dinah, that she's a Yatzanit, that she goes out, that it might be partially her fault also for going out.
Right.
When we would
That's
look at
true.
it, goes out, she wants to see Benot Haaretz. She wasn't going to see B'nai Haaretz. It's that,
Right. So I was not focusing on Dinah. What you said is true, that Vatetse Dinah Bat Leah, I would say, look, what they're picking up on, apart from Vatetse, because in the case of Amnon and Tamar, Tamar stays inside the house. She has no access to her. She doesn't leave the house, I think what Chazal might be picking up on is the Vatetse Dinah Bat Leah, Asher Yodav Yaakov, that what they're seeing, and I think it is well-founded, that expression, Vatetse Dinah Bat Leah Asher Yodav Yaakov, who's born to Yaakov, they're thinking of the story where Leah goes out. Vatetse Leah Likvato Vatomer Elai Tavo, Ki Sachar Schaticha Beduda B'ni. She goes to Yaakov and says, "Sleep with me tonight because I have rented you out with the mandrakes of my son." So they actually trade, Rachel and Leah trade Yaakov, and from those mandrakes, Dinah is actually born. She's one of the three that's born. The point is that they're connecting those stories. They're seeing Dinah in light of Leah, and they see Leah's behavior as problematic. But of course, in that story, once again, everybody's problematic. But Kisachar Secharticha, I've rented you out. That's what this family has become. Everybody is a commodity to be bought and sold. So I think they're picking up on that. But I was not focusing on Dinah's guilt of any sort. The main characters in the story I was focusing on is, on one end, well, of course, Shem. They're all connected because the more one person is guilty, the worse Amnon is, the better Tamar looks, the better Absalom looks for killing him. If he's basically a good guy who made a mistake, Amnon's not a good guy who made a mistake. He's a guy in the story with no redeeming qualities, zero. This is a bad person. So Absalom's behavior from that perspective is much more worthy than, say, Shimon and Levi, who kill someone who regrets what he did, it would appear, and B, they kill the town people. Yes, they bear the same name. Yes, maybe they want to benefit from it. That doesn't make them all rapists. It makes them people that want to benefit after the fact from a misdeed. And of course, they were presented with this scenario by Tamar. So I'm saying these again. My short answer is I wasn't really dealing with Dinah per se. No, I was not doing that. But the question is a good one.
I'm sorry, but
Whether the text false or not is a good question. That's a good question.
I'd like to make.
Rabbi Silber, there's
Yes.
the Vatetse Yaakov, which is the obvious, but he could not be Yoshev Ohalim forever, and all the turmoil and all the good stuff happens. Vatetse, one has to leave, at some point.
Right, but that's a different thing. There he's leaving there to run away, to find a wife. It's not the Vatetse per se that's the problem. It's the Vatetse Le'yale Kurato. It's what she says. Come
Right.
to me tonight because I've rented you out.
Mhm.
Which is a commentary not just about Leah, but upon Yaakov's. It's on Yaakov too. It's what Yaakov said to Lavan. I'll work 7 years for Rach. Tell me, what are your wages? I'll work 7 years for Rachel, your daughter. So the point is, Yaakov, is the one who says that Leah or Rachel is the payment for my labor, which is the way Lavan functions, as they say about their father. He buys and sells. He's a trader. And that's how Yaakov deals in the house of Lavan. It's very problematic. So it's not just Vatetse, the word. The word Vatetse appears many places, loads of places. And it's true. We're about to celebrate Yetziat Mitzrayim. It's a good thing. But the fact is, you have to see where you're going and why you're going and what the context is. Yes. Anybody else?
I'd like to make a comment.
Yeah, go ahead.
When I read the story of Eliezer and Rivka, I see parallels in a strange way to the story of Dinah, because Eliezer sees Rivka and gives her the nezem and the tzmidim, which is an act of acquiring a woman as the shaliach of Yitzchak, so that in a way he has acquired her as a wife before he's even talked to the family. It's only afterwards that he has to go to the family and take her. And then you have similar words. You have the word achosenu, and at the very end it's vayikach. You have similar words which are in a strange way parallel to the story of Dinah, because even after everything is done, they don't want to let her go. In fact, they would actually kill him if necessary. So he has to grab her after all this is agreed. And also the difference here is nish'allah is pihanaro. Whereas in Dinah, there's no such thing. Let's ask her. In Rivka's case, they ask her and she makes a decision. We don't know about Dinah, but there is a similar word to me, and maybe I'm wrong, but it appears to me a type of play on a different way of handling what occurs with Dinah and Shechem.
Well, I think they're opposite, actually. I think they're exactly diametrically opposite. It's
Exactly.
true that he gives her the rings, etc. Now, you put it in terms of engagement. I mean, perhaps that's a reading into the Torah, a rabbinic conception of kedusha. But the fact of the matter is, it's only a designation. What he's saying is, he comes with gifts. He comes with 10 camel loads of gifts. He's going to negotiate with the family. He's not going to grab her. All the negotiation takes place with the family until the very end, when they say, let's ask
Vayikach. Vayikach. That was at the very end.
Fine, that's what it is. You deal with the family, and there's an arranged marriage. She's never met him, and he does leave with the family's permission. The family says, let's ask her what she wants, and she says, hey, Leah. So at the end of the day, she makes the decision to go. That's for sure. But what you have is a very standard negotiation. It's a negotiation, but the point is, he comes with all kinds of camels loaded with gifts. He has to convince them to let this daughter go on some long journey to meet some unseen man. He's very clever the way he does that. But I don't see the taking at all. They are marriage stories of sort, for sure. One is after the fact, and one is before the fact. And by the way, I'll mention something else that Sternberg said, which is very good. I'm not here just to criticize. I think his overall take is misguided, for sure. But he makes some very good points. And here's a good point that he makes. that when the brothers say the last verse of chapter 34, "Hachazono yaseh et achotenu," shall we treat our sister as a zona? His point, the point that Sternberg makes is that when it appears that Yaakov is willing to go along with this idea that you'll give us our daughters, you come in the land, you'll do business with us. And from their perspective, what do you mean you'll do business with them? What is she, a prostitute? You give her money? No, that's not right. In other words, Sternberg reads that. I think it's a good reading. They're saying the complaint, which is against not just Shem, but against Yaakov, is, what do you mean you're willing to make this deal with them? Because it's a good business deal. Because it will give them their daughters, will dwell with us. You'll be able to, right? You have access to their possessions. That's how Shem and Hamor presented to the family. But from their perspective, that's just a zona. So that's what he says. So that's, in other words, no one was more aware of the fact that marriages have a material side to them. That's the very institution we call the ketuvah is testimony to that. These are the obligations of most of them of the groom to the bride. There's some reciprocal obligations as well. It's a contract. You don't want to reduce it to that, but it is in fact a contract, and contracts are there to protect both sides. So there's no question. But marriage is not the same as rape. That's all. It's different. And in the case of the servant, the Eved of Abraham, that's a contractual agreement. Yes, like every agreement, there's a lot of negotiating going on. He's a wonderful negotiator. Wish I had this guy for Drisha. He's terrific, actually. But the point is, yes, they're similar in the sense that each case involves getting a woman for a particular man. That's true, but I don't see and maybe some of the language is parallel because they're similar scenarios in that sense, but I don't see them as parallel at all. Oh, is anybody else? We'll move on.
Yeah, is there first of all, when he says Vayomru hachazona yaseh es achotenu, Vayomru is, I'm assuming, referring to Shimon and Levi.
Yes.
It's not referring to the other brothers. And what's striking is that Reuven and Yehuda are silent, as is Jacob. And what seems to me is that there is a conflicting goal here. There's the goal of building the inclusive bayit, but there's also the goal of settling the land. And that when they say Ubanav hayu mikneu basadeh, they're struggling with the fact that they're beginning to take over the land of Canaan. And how do they solve this problem? And it's Shimon and Levi that say, no, the family is more important than settling the land.
If I can comment on you, I like that point very much, because Jacob's argument saying, "Oh my God, the nations around us will come after us, we'll be pariahs." I mean, that's his fear, and he's very fearful of this. After he limped out of the incident with the Ish, he heals a little in Sukkot, and then he comes and he buys chunk of land in Shechem. Now this happens to me, and now look what you did, and so everybody's going to pick on us. But that never takes place. It actually never happens that the other nations come after Jacob and his nomadic family.
Well, that's the next story. We'll see about that. But the question is, why not? Is the question.
But no, they don't. They do it to them. Whatever they do to themselves, they do to themselves. But you don't read about
basically
surrounding nations ganging up on Jacob. In other words, what he feared because of Shimon and of his son's killing actions, what he feared never actually came to pass.
That's true. It doesn't, but the question is why it doesn't. Well, we'll see.
They don't have anything to do with any of the other people around, or the other people don't have anything to do with them. They may have become pariahs in the area. We don't know. That would
right, but they're not attacked by but they're not attacked by anybody else. That's clear. He says they're going to attack me, and they don't attack.
That's right.
But to that extent, he's not right. But they don't. We'll see why they don't attack, though. Question is why they don't attack. It would appear for me that they might have attacked. He wasn't. I don't think his fears are ill-founded. I think he has something to worry about, and I think the Chumash more or less says that. It's true that it doesn't happen, but it's also true that it very well could happen. And we'll see as we continue. We'll see the story. Let's continue a little bit. I'll leave time at the end for more comments and questions. Chapter 35. Let's begin 35. We'll see how far we can get. Vayomer Elohim o Yaakov, Kum alei Beit El v'sheb sham. V'aseh sham mizbeach la'el hanireh elecha v'vorchacha mipnei esav achicha. So now God speaks to Yaakov. We all remember that Yaakov had taken a vow in chapter 28. If you bring me back, says Yaakov, I will, in fact, build this rock that I placed down in chapter 28 shall become Beit Elohim, the house of God, right? So now he's told by God to go back. And God had mentioned this even earlier in chapter 31. I'm the God to whom you took a vow in Beit El. Go back to Beit El. Beit El, the house of God. He had put one pillar there. This pillar shall become the house of God. And now God reminds Yaakov of his vow. So the question is, why does Jacob have to be reminded? He did take a vow, and we all know when we make commitments, especially a vow, we should fulfill our promises. And Yaakov has to be told over here in the beginning of chapter 35, Kuma le Beit El v'sheb sham. I think the answer is actually very simple, because Yaakov's vow was, what Yaakov said in the vow in chapter 28, if you remember, was, if you give me food to eat, bread to eat, clothing to wear, v'shavti b'shalom el Beit David, and bring me back in peace to my father's house. But what Yaakov's concern is, I'm not being brought back in peace, because he thinks that a war is about to break out, in which the chances of him being massacred, and he was worried about this earlier with Esav as well, but there's a very strong possibility that I'll be attacked by the residents of the land. So when God says in chapter 35, go up to Beit El, what God is saying in effect is that I'm keeping my promise. I'm fulfilling your vow, which was V'shavti b'shalom el Beit David. I will return in peace to my father's house. So God essentially is saying to Yaakov, don't worry about what you're worried about. They're going to attack you. I am protecting you. They're not going to attack you. And since you are protected, since you have peace, now it's time to go and fulfill the vow that you yourself took in chapter 28. That's how chapter 35 begins. And then we have v'sheb sham. Go up to Beit El. Go up to Beit El. Go up. You always go up to God's place. Go up to Beit El. V'sheb sham, and stay there, remain there. That's an interesting statement, v'sheb sham. God could have said, go up to Beit El and bring the sacrifice. Go up to Beit El and fulfill your promise. But v'sheb sham is actually very interesting. Not just going there, staying there for a while. V'sheb sham. And I think Yaakov understands v'sheb sham, to be there, go to Beit El and be there. That Yaakov's understanding of God's command, v'sheb sham, is be there be there means prepare yourself there for what you promised to do. I'm thinking of, for example, let's talk about going to a sacred place which requires preparation in the Torah. Well, the sacred place that requires preparation in the Torah, in which the Torah, it spends more time on the preparation than it does on what happens there, is obviously chapters 19 and 20 of the book of Shemot, Exodus, the receiving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. In the third month, they came to the mountain, right? God speaks to Moshe, and there's all kinds of preparations. Clean your garments, set boundaries around the mountain, 3 days, right? Etc. Separation of men and women, all those preparations. Shloshet Yimei Hagbala, right? The 3 days of preparation. So we go to the holy place. Something's going to happen there. You're going to, like God said to Moses earlier in the book of Exodus, someday you'll come back and serve God on this mountain. Tavdun et Elohim al har hazeh, the instructions of the Mishkan. it requires Vishev Sham. You don't write, it doesn't happen right away. Vishev Sham. And Yaakov understands this. And God says to Yaakov, fulfill the vow. Aseh Sham Mizbeach, build yourself an altar. La'el Hanirei Lech, to the God who appeared unto you. B'vorchacha mipnei Esav achicha, when you were running away from your brother. Appeared to you is chapter 28. That's Jacob's dream, Jacob's vision. And it's very interesting that God describes that as the God who appeared unto you. Because when the Chumash presented back in chapter 28, we remember, it's put in terms of a dream. Jacob went to sleep, he had a dream, but now God says, I appeared to you then. I was appearing to you in that special place, Hamakom. That's where I appeared unto you. And we, the reader, think of that Hamakom, and we remember the Hamakom of the earlier Hamakom of Book of Bereshit, story of the binding of Isaac. Hamakom, that appears there 4 times. And Abraham names the place Hashem Yireh. Asher Ye'amer Hayom Bahar Hashem Yireh. The place that God appears. God may be seen, God may be perceived. It further identifies Jacob's situation, Jacob's story of Bethel, with the story of the binding of Isaac, with the special place. So God says, listen, you made a vow to the God who protects you and has been protecting you all along the way, all along your journey. Ever since you ran away from Esau, your brother, and implicitly God is saying is that I continue to protect you, right? I'm not going to abandon you. That's what God had said to Jacob. I'm not going to abandon you. I'm going to stay with you. So there is peace. And if there is peace, you have an obligation. And that's how Yaakov understands B'Shev Sham, because now in verse number 2, Vayoma Yaakov el Beito, v'el kol asher imo, hosiru et Elohei hanechar asher b'tochechem, v'taru, v'achalifu simlotechem. So he instructs. Interesting, verse number 2 is very interesting. Whom does he instruct? First of all, Beito, his bayit. He has a bayit. He instructs his bayit. And kol asher imo, and those that were with him. Who was with him outside of the bayit? It's hard to know, but we do know one thing. That at the end of chapter 35, the sons of Jacob pillaged the city of Shechem, right? It says in verse 27, verse 28, verse 29, it says, Bnei Yaakov came across the corpses. They despoiled the cities via Vozu Air, it's a negative word, that had defiled their sister. They took their cattle, right? The cattle, the horses, etc. And all in the field and in the house, they took the city and the house. And then it says they took the women and children, believe it or not. Tapam v'nasham. They took the women and the children. So now we have, whatever happens to those people, we never know. But apparently they were part of Jacob's house. So Jacob spoke to his bayit, and with all that were with him, presumably refers to all these new people they had picked up through the pillaging of Shechem. And what does he instruct all of them? The bayit and the people that are with him. Hasiru et Elohei hanechar asher b'tochechem. Rid yourself of the foreign gods that are amongst you. Sounds like these tzaddikim, in their great desire to avenge their sister, they also had decided to take some of this. We know they took the spoils of Shechem, and amongst the spoils of Shechem, it would appear, is what we would call avodah zarah, alien gods. It's possible that some of these alien gods were picked up in the house of Lavan. We know that Rachel took Trafim. It certainly is possible. But the adjoining of the two stories, namely the pillaging of Shechem, property and people, kol asher imo, and the existence in the house, in the bayit of Elohei Nechar, foreign gods, that would suggest that at least some of the foreign gods have been taken from Shechem. There's further evidence of that, as we'll see in a minute. And I don't think it's just the foreign gods of the people that they picked up. And even if that's true, they haven't gotten rid of the foreign gods. So wherever they came from, where they put them in their own pockets, Whether they were in the pockets of the people they had taken from the city, that's an open question. But my point is, in looking back now at Shimon, Levi, and all the family, I mentioned several reasons why I believe strongly that the Torah condemns them on some level. It's not black and white. There is a condemnation. I mentioned 3 or 4 reasons. We can add this to, this is now 4 or 5, because they took Avodah Zarah from there. So we can't speak of this people having the purest motives, right? It's not about that. It's complicated. They see a good opportunity to pillage the city, to take whatever they can take. They took Avodah Zarah. And later, actually, just a couple of verses later, it says they gave to Yaakov in verse number 4, Vayinu Yaakov et kol Elohei hanechar asher biyadam, v'et hanizamim asher biyosnehem. They took, it says, they gave to Jacob the foreign gods, which they possessed, asher biyadam, and the nizamim, the rings that were in their ears. Now here, 2 things are interesting about this. First of all, that rings, right? We know that rings are often used in idolatrous practice. We know this from the story, the war against Midian in the book of Bamidbar, or the golden jewelry they had taken, which they have to dedicate to the temple. We know this in terms of the golden calf, right? Golden calf. What does it say about the golden calf? It's also, right? What does it say over there? Let me just read that a second. What does Aaron say? Let me see what this is. Yes, chapter 32.
They took it out from their
verse number
ears.
3. Verse number 2. Parku nizmei hazahav asher biyoznei neshechem b'nechem uvnotechem. Take off the golden rings, which are in the ears of your wives, your sons and daughters. So, and that's the golden calf. You have the story of Gideon as well. I mean, I don't want to belabor the point, since it's obvious as anything, that the rings actually, so there's the idols, and there's the rings which are connected to the idols, which are related to idolatry. It's actually something else very interesting about verse number 4. Small point. And that is that they gave to Jacob, it says, the foreign gods asher biyadam, v'et hanizamim asher biyaznehem. Here the Chumash thinks there's a very clever point over here, which is the word biyadam, the word biyad, X, that appears in many places. In biblical Hebrew, in the Talmud, biyad often means under the control of, tachat yad paro, the control of, right? In the Talmud, of course, biyado means somebody you have control over something, over a situation. If you can do X, that gives you credibility, right? Because it's biyado. I couldn't believe me that I did it because I can do it. That's biyado. But in this verse, in verse number 4, it's interesting. They gave Jacob all of the foreign gods asher biyadam. There, I think that the Chumash wants us to read biyadam literally in their hands because of what follows. V'et hanizamim asher biyaznehem, and the rings in their ears. So then the rings in their ears means literally in their ears. Unless it means rings that they could wear, earrings. But if it means in their ears, they took off the, right? As Aaron says, take off the rings in the ears, right? So therefore, we then can read biyadam, not just they possess them, they're actually holding on to them, which makes it even more problematic. It's not just they have idols somewhere in their closet or no, in their suitcases. It's in their hand, holding them. So get rid of those. You can't go to Beit El, to God's house, if there's Avodah Zarah. The expression in the Gemara is Tovel v'sheretz biyado. You go to the mikveh, you're holding on to a sheretz, impure, so it makes you impure. It doesn't work. Got to get rid of the impurity. What does Jacob do with these things? Vayitmon otam Yaakov tachat ha'elah asher im shechem. What does Jacob do? He buries them under the terebinth, under the tree. Elah means a tree. Sometimes Elah, perhaps from the word El, maybe a sacred tree, maybe a tree that was worshipped, like an Asherah. But he takes the idolatrous objects, he takes the rings, he leaves them in Shechem. Tachat ha'elar asher im Shechem. We don't want to take anything from Shechem. Shechem is problematic. We want to distance ourselves from Shechem. This is another, these verses, I think,
It's not a report, it's a
the
question.
problematic nature of what they've done. It's not clean here. They went to Shechem. They took Avodah Zarah from Shechem. It's in their hands. It's in their ears. So another evidence. I don't think we need more evidence. The Chumash is not interested in simply whitewashing Shimon and Levi or Jacob's sons in general. That whole behavior is problematic because if in fact what your goal was to save your sister, you wouldn't want to take any. It's what Abraham said to the king of Sodom. I didn't do this for any kind of profit. I did it to save my nephew and I saved other people. I don't want to give the impression that I have mixed motives over here. I'm not interested in that. That would impute to me something that's not right. That would cast a negative light on what I did. I did it for the right reasons. I want you to understand it. It's not to benefit. I don't want to take anything from you. Not even sroch now. Not the smallest piece of rechush. Nothing. And the same.
But Abraham, Rabbi, but Abraham doesn't learn that lesson for a long time. He didn't learn it in Mitzrayim. Okay. He didn't learn it from Avimelech. He gets 1,000 shekels silver. I mean, that's astonishingly high to cover the eyes of his wife. So yes, Abraham says this to Avimelech, but their whole story is different. Avimelech, and he did the right thing vis-a-vis saving his brother, even though it's his nephew. He calls him Anashim Achim Anachnu. So, but Abraham, it takes him a really long time, and he's pretty bad.
That's fine. Okay, I agree. Yeah. I totally agree, but that's not my point. I totally agree. My point is that when people, if you did an act which involves idolatry, pillaging, etc., apart from the excessive violence, there is no way, and the Torah says they spoke for Mirma, there is no way to say that the Torah takes their side. That's complete madness. Nobody with two eyes could possibly read it that way. On the other hand, yes, they have a point, and Jacob doesn't come out smelling very good at the story either. Nobody does. And there's no reason to assume that the narrator, the biblical author, the Torah, God, or whatever you want to call it, is constrained by taking one side or another. The Torah is a free agent, and the Torah has zero interest in taking someone's side. There's plenty of blame to go around, and it's clear that the Torah is spreading the blame in every direction. No one comes clean out of the story, which in general is the story of the Chumash, and in general is the story of human beings. It's not black and white. That's what makes it a great book. It's not black and white. But in this case, the brothers are very problematic, without question. Anyway, what time is it now?
11:13.
Okay, I have to stop there at this point. Let me take a couple of comments and questions. I want to remind everybody that at 12 o'clock, we have the Rappaport lecture. Dr. Gafni will be speaking. Hanan Gafni is very interesting. And it's a pre-Pesach lecture. Okay, let me take a couple of comments or questions.
Perhaps that's why she is also referred to as a Zona. Even if she was raped, there is still that stigma attached to her. Like you're saying, nobody comes out totally clean on this. Everybody there's both sides to it. That even if she was raped, they still call her a Zona, that it's...
No, they don't call her a Zona.
No, they don't call her a Zona.
They don't call her a Zona. They say you're treating her like they're saying she's not a Zona, is what they're saying.
No,
your behavior is suggesting she's a Zona, which she is not. By the way, I would never suggest that in every situation in the world, everybody shares the blame. I mean, yes, it's true, as Heschel said, that to the extent that we live in the world, we take some responsibility for the world. But there are victims, okay? Heschel's point was, yes, Jewish people were victims of the Nazis and been victims very often, but we do live in this world, we're part of the world, and to that extent, since we're part of the world, we have an obligation to try to make it better. But there are victims, you know? If you're living in some city in Ukraine with your family and somebody drops a bomb on your house, you're a victim. That's very straightforward. They're not saying that she's guilty. Whether her going out is problematic or not is a good question. But they're not saying she's a zoner. They're saying the opposite. His behavior is suggesting she's a zoner. The way he's going to take money for this. Well, what is she, a zoner? You don't take money. The things you don't take any money for. I don't care what the price is. I'm not doing it. And that's the, so they're saying the opposite. They're blaming Yaakov. They're blaming Yaakov and Shem, of course, but they're also, I think, who is the he? Shall he treat her like a zona? It's unclear. Is it Shem or is it Shem and Yaakov? I think it's both, actually. I don't think they're saying it to him. I think they're saying it to themselves, about him. Anybody else?
About the silence of the fathers, it seems to me that perhaps the silence of David is actually the writer of Samuel is illuminating the meaning of the silence of Jacob, because in the case of David's silence, I think, means I actually set it up, so I'm complicit and I'm not sure exactly how to distribute punishment. And actually, with Jacob, he also is complicit because he didn't guard his family. He didn't tell her not to go out.
It's not clear that her going out is bad in the story.
Well,
he didn't stop her from leaving the house. The question
is, exactly. He didn't, right, exactly.
Well, I understand that, but I'm saying, I'm wondering whether that's my question, whether going out to see the daughters of the land. I would say something else about David.
But that's my point. He's hesitating because he's introspective. He doesn't actually, he's not clear how to work out how guilt lies. But
I'm not sure about guilt. I'm saying I'm not clear about the guilt part of it. I would say something else about David, though, which is not true in the Jacob story. And that is, it's all in the book, but I'll say it anyway. The book is written in not a simple Hebrew, so many people can't read the book. The fact is, here's the point. The story of Amnon and Tamar is chapter 13 of Shmuel Bet. Chapter 11 and 12 of Shmuel Bet is David and Bathsheba. And the problem with David and Bathsheba is a very simple problem. What's he going to say to his son? Son, we don't rape women. Oh, really? What did you do 2 chapters ago? That's not consensual. The king summons her to come. Does she have a choice? I don't think so. The Tanakh never suggests that she's guilty in that chapter. It never says anything about Bathsheba. In other words, when you misbehave, it puts you in a situation where you can't actually lecture anybody else. Now, it is true that there are some people going around lecturing all kinds of things which they themselves are guilty in spades. I know such people. That's a separate problem. But really, from a moral standpoint, it's very difficult to tell somebody not to. What you could say is, son, I made the same mistake. You shouldn't do it. But the point is that it follows upon, one might say, that the tragedy of Absalom, in a certain sense, this is actually a very deep point in Shmuel. The tragedy of Absalom, which I believe is the real tragedy of the book, because he's the right guy to succeed. The tragedy is that David's inability to do the right thing is what creates an Absalom who ends up in a very bad place. He in the story of Amnon and Tamar, I think he does the right thing. But beyond that, David's inability to deal with it. And his inability to deal with it is a function of David's own misbehaviors, has put him in a position where it's very difficult for him to be an advisor or kind of an ethical mentor to a son who behaves in a similar fashion, or to punish someone who's done what he himself has done. And that's the problem of misbehavior, that basically anybody with any kind of moral sense feels it's, what am I to tell the other guy? There probably is a way to do it. Don't make the mistake that I made. That you can say that, but it's not so simple to do that. So I think that a little different than the story of Yaakov. I'm not convinced that her going out is a negative. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. It's tough for me to judge. We're not living in that setting. It's true that the text connects it to Leah, and that I think is a negative. I have to stop at this point. If other people have comments, we'll continue next time with chapter 35. Great chapter, actually. There's a lot more to be said about, but we'll start again with 35. And we'll hopefully get up to, well, We'll see how far we get next week. I think this is the last class before Pesach. We'll continue after Pesach. We have a whole bunch of things, interesting things for Pesach, starting with 12 o'clock today. He's very interesting, and if you haven't registered, I advise you to do so. I find him quite interesting. Noah, you want to pick up and say something?
Okay, so first of all, thank you as always, Rabbi Silber, for a wonderful class, and to everyone here for participating in our learning community. Your questions and comments really, really do enrich everything that we're talking about. As Rabbi Silber mentioned, we do have a lot coming up. The link for our event that is actually at noon Eastern today is in the chat. If you would like to register and join us, I'm very excited for it, and I hope to see many of you there. We additionally have lots of other Pesach and non-Pesach programming that we will be rolling out, God willing, over the next couple of days. So please make sure to check your emails. We do like to be in touch with folks somewhat frequently. We try not to annoy you, but we do want to keep you up on everything that's happening, including a fun, I shouldn't say fun, an interesting music project that will be the first, hopefully, of many, a little bit different of a direction for Drisha, but I'm excited for it, and I hope that everyone will enjoy it and get something out of it when that is released very soon.
I would say that the music project will be a major initiative. Starting with this, say for Pesach, we have a, not a tiny project, a little project for the Seder. And then hopefully we will be building on that in different directions. It's the integration of music and liturgy. And that should be, I'm very involved in that. It's something I care about very much. And I'm looking forward to rolling this thing out and developing it over time. I think it's one of the more exciting things we'll be doing. Anyway, so we'll stay tuned.